Welcome to a new vision of reality, TSK for the 21st century, our new series on the time-space knowledge vision. TSK starts from the radical suggestion that deep, open-ended, sustained inquiry into time, space, and knowledge, as fundamental facets or elements of our being, can have a profoundly transformative impact on our ways of being and knowing in the world. Many in our time, as we are moving into the third decade of the 21st century, feel that we're caught up rather surprisingly in various crises of meaning and sense-making. And I've long felt that TSK is powerfully resonant with and relevant to the various integral, metamodern, and other communities attempting to address these crises. So I wanted to open up a series where we could explore TSK retrospectively, considering its origins and intentions, and prospectively, in light of what wisdom and ways of working it might offer us going forward. For our second episode in the series, we're joined by Ron Purser, a longtime TSK practitioner and commentator, a former professor of management at San Francisco State University, an instructor at Dharma College in Berkeley, and the author of the recent bestseller, McMindfulness. Well, welcome, Ron. It's great to see you. I've been in contact with you over many years at different TSK retreats, but we haven't really had a chance to dialogue in this way before, so I'm looking forward to it. Welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks.
Yeah, to start off, I'd like to just ask you, how did you learn about and get involved with TSK? What led up to it, and what attracted you to it? What's kind of your TSK story?
TSK story.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I remember I was a freshman in college at Southern Illinois University, SIU, Carbondale at the time, about 1979 or so. And I don't know. I must have bought the Time, Space, and Knowledge book, the very first book, which was published in 1977. I had it on my shelf. I picked it up, tried to read it, and I said, nah. And I put it back on the shelf. And so a couple of years later, I transferred to Sonoma State University in my junior year and picked up the book again and noticed that the Nyingma Institute, the Nyingma Tibetan Institute was in Berkeley. And I said, wow, maybe I'll check on that, check to see if they have any courses on this, because I certainly can't make too much sense out of this book, but I know there's something really profound and different and unique about this particular teaching. And sure enough, they had an introductory class on time, space, and knowledge in 1982, and then they were offering at that time what was called the 10-month time, space, and knowledge program, which we met twice a week, and then we had retreats that were associated with the program. So I went through that program in 1983. But I think what pulled me into it before that was I was a dabbler, like many people in my generation at that time, just kind of really not knowing what Buddhism was or what Zen was, and reading Alan Watts and doing LSD and all that kind of stuff, psychedelics. But I had a period in my life where I ran into a very unusual man who lived across the street from me when I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I actually lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma for about a year and a half. I took off on my motorcycle. I was heading to Arizona because I thought I would end up in Tempe because I kind of liked I was thinking about going to the college there. But I never made it because I had some friends in Tulsa. So, make a long story short, I was going to an esoteric bookstore called Peace of Mind Bookstore in Tulsa and reading a lot of books. And I met this unusual man who was a psychic, a clairvoyant, very gifted. He was sort of a mentor for me, and I started doing things with him in terms of some inquiries and practices, and I had a period of my life that probably lasted a year or two where I was having spontaneous precognitive and clairvoyant experiences coming to me and happening, and that's when I began to become very interested in parapsychology. So actually, when I was at Southern Illinois University, I went to one of my professors and asked if I could do an independent study on parapsychology, and he said, no, we don't really do that kind of stuff here. And serendipity happened, and I went to a guest lecture on campus, and Stanley Krippner, who is one of the early parapsychologists, was giving a talk there on dream telepathy. And I went up to him after the talk. I said, hey, where can I go to study parapsychology? And humanistic psychology is what I was interested in, because at Southern Illinois University, it was kind of experimental psychology. Wasn't really interested in that. And he said, you should go to Sonoma State. So I did. So that's kind of how I circled around and then eventually began to study time, space, and knowledge.
Great. Yeah. How would you characterize the time, space, knowledge vision as you've worked with it and experienced it over the years? And it seems to slip outside of familiar boundaries or characterizations, what philosophy or religion or anything like that. So what kind of beast is kind of cryptid?
Yeah, I think that's probably intentional, because one of the intentions of time, space, and knowledge is to question any sort of boundary or disciplinary boundary, as well as any kind of conceptual fixation, which might limit our ability to know. So for that reason, it's very slippery in the sense that it's hard to categorize, because categories are part of the inquiry within time, space, and knowledge, is to look at how our conceptual constructs are actually limiting our ability to know in a greater way. So, but I do like the term vision, because it is a way of knowing, or a way of seeing in a different way. It is a view, if you want to think about it as a kind of a traditional Buddhist point of view. The view is very important to guide inquiry and to guide any kind of contemplative journey or inquiry. But it's a profound piece of work. I mean, just to backtrack a bit, Tarthang Tulku came to the United States in 1969. Didn't speak hardly any English, had hardly any money, and the West was a completely new culture for him. I mean, he lived in India for, I think, about 9 years. But, in the beginning, he was trying to teach his Western students more traditional Tibetan Nyingma practices, and he was very sort of disappointed in the cultural, not just the cultural barriers, but the nature of the Western mind itself was very different. And so he really put a lot of time into formulating this new vision, this new piece of work called Time, Space, and Knowledge, and extraordinary amount of time developing that first manuscript, which was done, it's kind of done orally with an editor taking notes or recordings, but it was a back and forth process between him and Steve Tainer in the first book, and it was over 3,000 pages of transcripts that were generated, which then had to be distilled down to the 300 pages now in the first book. So I guess what I'm saying is that, knowing Tarthang Tulku and just how he values his time, to put that much time into some project like this, as well as many of the other sequels that came, to me, it's definitely a very important piece of work, which, may not be appreciated for 100 to 200 years from now. I mean, in some ways, maybe our culture will catch up to it later on. But to me, it's I'm not trying to say this is the greatest thing, and it's the best teaching or anything like that, but I'm saying it is extremely unusual and very carefully constructed and put together.
Yeah, I have a sense of it almost being a secular terma in a sense,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of his students have kind of thought about that in terms of a term of teaching. Yeah, timely. Well, he says in the preface that this book could have wrote itself, and there's some rumors that someone asked him, how did this? He said, well, a hummingbird gave me this teaching. So.
Yeah, I heard Jack say one time that maybe the original working title for the book was One Afternoon, a Crazy Idea, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very important. I think that the term vision is really key, and I think it carries through many of the other sequels to Time, Space, and Knowledge.
What has your relationship been to the different dimensions of TSK, the time, space, and knowledge domains? Have you noticed any kind of patterns or cycles in terms of your resonance and work with those different domains at different times in your life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, these three facets of human experience, space, time, and knowledge. Space is often associated with our embodiment, the focus on embodiment. And I think that initially was probably what really had a profound impact on me in the early days. Because by focusing on opening up what we consider to be our own body, and then that extends further, of course, into our psychophysical embodiment, not just our physical embodiment, that it kind of nurtured, you could say, it nurtured a very sort of relaxing openness quality to my own being. And so there was a lot less anxiety, there was more relaxation, learning how to let go of particular fixations. That's sort of the unfolding of that dimension. And then time is very interesting because I do see different rhythms happening at particular times. And there could be times when things are very dynamic, focused, almost obsessed kind of energy, which is really focused on getting things done. And then there's times when you just feel very inspired, kind of the creative juices are flowing and this is where the interaction with space comes in, because as space opens, it's almost like time becomes more alive, more dynamic. And your mind is, knowledge is kind of, also kind of receptive to allowing, the flow of energy, the flow of thoughts, the flow of inspiring, and also the compartmentalization between what we consider the unconscious and the conscious is also melted and also sort of becomes fluid. So I think you're more receptive to things that appear in dreams. Like dreams can be very informative. I just think that communication, internal communication, it's almost like you're developing a partnership with with parts of your own mind that you weren't that familiar with. But probably more importantly is that the position that one takes as the knower begins to shift. And so the effort or the feeling that one has to always be the agent in charge of one's psychophysical embodiment begins to also open up. And in that sense, the phrase is you get out of your own way, and things emerge and come to you that you were like, wow, where did that come from? Well, it didn't come from what you already know. It didn't come from what's already known. So there is that sort of dynamic quality, or what do you want to call it? Something more inspirational, alive, fresh, energizing. So that's the time aspect, I think, that has really influenced me in many ways. And I've said this to a number of people, that throughout my academic career, I always have felt that whatever I was working on or writing about was being somehow in the background, being informed by the time-space knowledge vision. And the nature of my discipline is pretty open, actually, for management. I'm in the Department of Management Studies, Organizational Studies. Pretty open field compared to other fields. So I was able to play on the fringes in many ways with the sorts of topics that I was interested in. Anything from creativity, social creativity. I even did a kind of a stint for a while on organizational time and time studies. Obviously, you can see the connection there. So in that respect, I feel that it's influenced my thinking and my professional life as well. It's only recently that I completely sort of abandoned the management project and decided to reinvent myself in terms of doing more work in the Buddhist studies area. So as I was mentioning that, I don't even go to any management conferences anymore. They're boring and sort of useless. And so I hang out with the Buddhist studies scholars.
Much better company. Though I've also been impressed with what you can get away with in apparently the management discipline compared to some others.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it wasn't, I think it got like that over time, because when I saw that the Academy of Management, which is the professional group, started a interest group called Management, Spirituality, and Religion, MSR. I said, yeah, all right. And then they created their own Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion. So I published a few things there.
That reminds me of, I wanted to ask you about one of your essays, and it ties into what you were just talking about in terms of some of the working with the different domains.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a really beautiful essay you wrote a number of years ago on questioning space through experiential practice.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really liked that one. And I thought you very carefully went through different practices and different levels of space experience. And I wanted to ask, not to repeat the whole essay, but for people, listening who aren't that familiar with TSK practice, could you kind of walk us through what that space practice, that space inquiry or deep questioning looks like?
I could try. It's difficult to do, but well, first of all, the Time-Space Knowledge book, the very first book, starts, it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is on space. So even though the title starts with time, so I've always made note that seems important to me. Why did he start with space? So that's a key question. But the way the book is structured is it's a very careful sort of philosophical investigation of these basic facets of our experience, space being the first one, complemented by a series of, if you want to call them exercises or meditations or thought experiments, may be another way of thinking about it. And in the space section, there are 15 of these exercises that complement the philosophical sort of text. So the very first set of 6 exercises, per se, are called the giant body exercises. They're called the giant body exercises because you're asked to imagine a giant body, and that you're very, very, very small in size in comparison. And through imagination or through feeling, to explore all the intricate systems and subsystems of the giant body. So you kind of imaginatively go into all the structures of the body in great detail. And then progressively, those exercises then ask you to see all the boundaries, for example, of the organs or the cells, or the veins, is made up of all these tinier and smaller microsystems, so that the more you go into a system, you can continually open it into more subsystems and subsystems, to the place where it's very difficult at the micro level, that you're kind of like in a realm of space. And the other exercises that are complementing that then ask you to transparentize, the word transparentize, kind of to open up all the boundaries and outlines and make them ecstatic and shining and transparent to your point of view, and to examine the giant body from all points of view, inside, outside, all angles. And then you're asked to completely open up what you think, in terms of what you conceptually think of what it means to open up your idea of opening up. And those exercises, those series are, I think, exercises 1 through 5. And after you've familiarized yourself, and this is, I think, is an important point, that these exercises are difficult in the beginning. It's very difficult to get a stable image. Some people have problems with visualizing, but you can use your imagination. You could pretend that you're watching some sort of sci-fi movie, and imagine, with the special effects nowadays, that this, you can kind of conjure up this kind of idea. But even if you can't see it visually in your mind, you can still contemplate the exercise. It'll still work. And so that, as that occurs, as you become more, as you cultivate a more stable image, then you can kind of progress into this idea of transparentizing and opening it up. Because if you pass over that phase, I would say the rest of the book really won't take. There's something really important about this notion of space that is almost the ground of the ground that we have to become familiar with, and not as a fundamental, not as something underlying appearances or ordinary reality, not as something as foundational either, because then the problem here, I think, is we're trying to evoke a way of knowing that is not contingent on what we already know, our constructs. And so the way that we know is already conditioned by wanting to know things and objects, and to name them and to identify them. But that is not the sort of knowing that the time-space knowledge vision is interested in. At the same time, it's not trying to negate our ordinary way of knowing. So we start with things, and we use creative ways, and we end up almost in a kind of indirect way coming to an impasse, in a way, which is not a stopping point. It's actually the beginning of an opening point. So we start with things, and we begin to see that the way that we know is a product of a particular focal setting. And that is a term that's used in some of the TSK books. That we've embodied a way of knowing, and we see through this particular focal setting. And one of the products of that focal setting is the image of the self as the knower who's seeing objects in an external world. And that is the focal setting which begins to become, you could say, the object of meditation, the meditation object, if you want to think about it in a Buddhist point of view. And as you expand your notion of space, that focal setting begins to relax, begins to open up. And that is sort of the beginning or the glimpse, just the initial glimpse of the possibility of what he calls a higher way of knowing, a different way of knowing. But what we're really trying to understand really is this whole structure that's been set up, sort of our presuppositions that we've embodied through culture, that we've learned for very good reasons. I mean, in his later works, more recent works, he refers to this structure as the regime of mind. That mind operates as if it's a regime. And a regime is something that is so total that we don't really know what's outside the regime. We think this is the way things are. This is the way our mind works. This is reality. What our mind is presenting to us is reality. So we have kind of a naive realism going on, in a way, in terms of epistemology. The external world is just an inference based on sensory inputs. But given, the culture of scientific materialism, physicalism, which is, deeply kind of in our way of seeing, that's our vision. The modern mind, the modern world has a vision as well, which is problematic because that vision actually is denying our subjectivity in a way. This whole focus on neuroscience, looking for the neural correlates of meditative experience, we're looking at chemicals. and so this new vision of reality, which Tarthang Tulku was trying to put forth, is saying, no, reality is not as what it seems to be. It's a product of a particular focal setting. So this series of exercises on space then progress into the mental aspect by examining. You could even think of it a little bit like mindfulness, is to be aware of the body-thought-mind interplay. But I think there's a bit of a twist here that you don't see in mindfulness because you're asked to pay attention to the self that's also coming up as you're observing the mental continuum or the mental contents. Anyway, these series of exercise advance to the point where an exercise 15, the last exercise in the space series, is called the mountain exercise, which is quite profound because you're asked to sit somewhere high outside when there's a clear blue sky and actually learn how to gaze at this blueness and take it into the body and then reviewing all the previous exercises. And that exercise requires a lot of commitment because it takes a lot of time to do that. Anyway, I've been rambling a bit.
That's a great explanation. Yeah, I think that's really resonates with me too in my own experience of that practice. And I've always loved the giant body exercises and the working through the transparentizing the boundaries. And I use that occasionally in some of my classes when I introduce TSK. A lot of the students in the context where I work are very focused on embodiment. And so,
that's a word that's bantied around quite a bit now, and I'm not sure if anybody really knows what that means.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a really popular word.
That's what I like about it is that TSK, engages with that concept, but it kind of reveals that what we presuppose about it may not have much grounding or footing. I was reminded of what Rinpoche said once about be here now is a great idea, except most people don't know what's meant by be here or now, right?
Yeah. That's another one. I wanted being in the present moment and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's maybe we can come back to that on the whole time reflection, and because TSK I think gives us a much more nuanced and rich experience and conception of time than just being in the present, which is a kind of a limited uh, focal setting in a sense. Um,
Hmm.
what I wanted to ask, and this was not something I planned to talk about, but uh, you know, there's some comparison between TSK and Buddhism, and Rinpoche
Hmm.
has been very clear that TSK is not another Buddhism. Is
Hmm.
not Buddhism; it's its own independent thing. But I was wondering what your sense is of a homeomorphic equivalency and analog between the levels of TSK and in Tibetan practice, something like what you were just describing for working with the giant body and the kind of the progressive movement through that. And say in Tibetan practice of Anu Yoga, or actually I would say Mahayoga, Anu Yoga, and then Ati Yoga, where Mahayoga involves, visualizing the deity, and it kind of loosens your identification and allows for more expanded sense of identification and being. And then at Anu Yoga, it moves away from kind of image and representation towards more direct participation in you could say the flow of energy, the flow of time, with Salung practice and Trulkor practice and that kind of thing. And then Ati Yoga more being just uh, the profound uh, laziness and letting go into into self liberation, but where there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to transform or accomplish. Where the tantra would work on that, and Dzogchen would not anymore work to transmute. It would allow it um, to rise in its own space. So uh, I don't. Do you see any correlation between the levels that you move through in the giant body and that progression through the Maha and Anu and Ati yogas?
I tend not to do to comparison to any sort of other Buddhist teachings. I know that there's a lot of interest in doing that, and but I see your question. Obviously, Tarthang Tulku is a one of the last living traditional Tibetan masters who had training in these profound teachings and traditions. Obviously, he's been influenced by that. But I think this is quite unique. And he says this is a gift to the West. At one time I was very much kind of comparing it that way to Ati Yoga and Dzogchen. But I think over the last 10, 15 years, 10 years or so, I've really come to appreciate its novelty and originality. I think that's what's beautiful about it is just how it is, as you said, a secular. It's definitely intentionally a secular teaching, because when he first brought it out, he had hopes, and there were actually quite a bit of interest in the early days between scientists and philosophers and psychologists, and he wanted to see time-space knowledge as a way to bridge the limits between religion and science. So I think that's part of my response to that. He uses the term knowledge and great knowledge as sort of maybe a way of trying to point to something that is quite inconceivable to our conceptual way of knowing. He's used other metaphors over the years. Some of them have been quite interesting. Like he talks about, can we open to a 360-degree way of knowing? This idea of 360 degrees, which is sort of a metaphorical image of the capacity of mind to not have any point of reference or source. That this kind of cognizance or knowingness is not confined by any kind of particular space-time boundary. And this is, where we really depart in terms of the vision of the modern Western mind. As if we take knowledge as something that's the product of a brain or the product of a particular self in a body located in a particular time and space, then it just seems inconceivable. How could knowledge know without a self that knows? It requires a self which is positioned in a particular space, a particular time. So here we have, this really profound challenge to our ordinary way of knowing, which seems ineffable and inconceivable. When you use the term levels, he refers to this as the third level in time space, and these are arbitrary. He says, look, these are just arbitrary ways of talking for now. Our ordinary way of knowing, which does have this dualistic sort of positioning, is the first level. And then as we open things up, there's a transitory level, kind of a transition level called the second level. And then the third level is what I just mentioned. Is the problem, I think, that we often encounter on the path, when I think of it as a path, is we try to take perhaps glimpses of the second and third level and try to make sense of them within our first level categories and constructs. Try to explain it or turn it into a system, and to me that's counterproductive. It's sort of almost a reactive response, because he makes a really profound statement in the Time Space Knowledge book that sticks with me, and I can't remember exactly how it goes, but he almost says that great knowledge is too much for the self to handle. And it's almost as if we contract back. It's almost overwhelming because it's a threat to our sense of existential identity. Our identity is dependent on limitations. And so it's almost like a deep existential fear of this profound groundlessness or openness or knowingness that's not dependent on a particular self or position that the knower has to maintain. And I think another point is this whole notion of reality itself is something which we need to be careful about, because he basically says that this is a vision of totality, but without it involving any reality that could become open. It's already open. So, and this is another, I think, parallel, getting back to your question, there is definitely a parallel here, is that in the beginning, if we're starting, we have to start from where we are. And when we start from where we are, everything looks linear. We think we have to go from where we are now, and we engage in exercises, we engage in contemplative exercises, study, and we think we have to get to this other state, which is, we imagine and fantasize that this is the awakened state, or whatever you want to call it. And this whole structure is something that is really examined very closely in time-space knowledge, the from-to structure. It's a temporal structure, and it's a structure that underlies our whole way of constructing a narrative of our identity over time. It's almost that we need this temporal structure as a way of having a identity. Without it, the self cannot maintain its sense of continuity over time, and its sense of the memories, the continuation of feedback loops that are constantly operating and creating this sense of self over time, this sense of permanence, a sense of identity. But taking that onto the path itself, that when we start out, we start at where we are. But as we work with these things, we looking back, we see that first level it's encompassed by the third level. It's not negated. But then this whole idea, this language that we use of going from and to begins to be less useful or less potent. And so there's the whole relaxation of a goal-orientedness. And it's so you could say this is a no-path approach, that we're ultimately starting with the result. In a way, we're starting with the result, but we have to unfreeze. That's another word I love. Unfreeze these structures, or the structures of the regime of mind, which are so encompassing and so entrancing that they cover over this nature of mind, which it does not require these particular lower level structures. We can't see it, but we always have some vague intuition that there's something more besides this mechanistic way of being, this mechanistic sort of regime of mind. We have an intuition. At some deep level, we know this can't be all there is. Right? I mean, that's the whole religious impulse. And so I think that's what's really unique about this particular vision. It's really more of appreciating the value of our human potentiality in the deepest sense of the word. And the word freedom is used a lot in time-space knowledge. And I think he really means that inner freedom, the freedom to tap into storehouse of capacities that we may not even be aware of. As I mentioned when we first talked, I got into this because of these paranormal experiences. I said, there's something going on here that I can't explain it. What are these potentials? Not that I'm seeking to have them or anything like that, but it certainly points to that I think we're denying or negating or avoiding these human potentials when we don't want to inquire into these structures, which are quite innate, deeply innate. And so I think there probably are some parallels, but I think the common ground is that there is an intrinsic freedom that is the nature of our own mind. And whether you want to categorize it as some sort of higher level of Tibetan Buddhism or time-space knowledge, I don't think it makes too much difference.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And the context for my question was just, I happened last week to listen to an interesting dialogue between Bard, who's kind of what he calls a syntheist, type of philosophical movement, and he was in dialogue with some Tantra practitioners, and they were looking at Lacan and different kinds of Western psychological framings as well, and just kind of exploring what are some of the gifts of Tantra for our self-understanding and our way of working now. And I really feel that TSK, it's not in the Tantra lineage, it's not that, but it gives a secular way in to some of those kinds of considerations and explorations that I think can be really powerful and fruitful, as I think you've just been, demonstrating here.
Yeah, well, I that's interesting. There are some aspects of time-space knowledge where you're working with emotions and feelings, which is very different than, let's say, a Vipassana approach. And, because he does use the idea that, emotion, just think of the term, it's movement, right? It's something that is moving. So that immediately evokes the idea of time. And so what I really appreciate is that all emotions are embraced as potentials for alchemical transformation. And I think that's where there is kind of a resonance there. For example, anger is a very strong emotion with a lot of energy, but it can be embraced in a way that if you're not identified with it, then that energy can be really kind of transmuted into this incredible clarity. And I think this is really important because this is just a kind of a biased statement, but I think the import of what we consider to be mindfulness, Western mindfulness, Vipassana, that was imported from the Southeast Asian monastic tradition. Now, obviously, it was opened up to the lay movement, and lay people were introduced to meditation and mindfulness meditation. But I think the approach is very different when it comes to emotions. In the obviously in the tantric approach versus the Vipassana approach. And I think for the Western world, I think that it might be more suitable in some ways rather than trying to just observe emotions. And, I don't know. It seems there's been some interesting studies, sociological studies on Western Vipassana practitioners, and they often become very detached and cold and almost rigid. I know I'm being critical now, but I don't know. There's something missing there that I can't put my finger on yet.
Years ago, when I was in Asia, I went to a extended Vipassana retreat on Penang Island in Malaysia, and I remember meeting with the teacher. We had the daily meetings with the teacher after hours of practice, and I talked about some of my own experience of things and some of my own ways of approaching things, and somehow the concept of music came up.
Oh yeah.
And he told me, when I mentioned music, that the further I progressed in this path, Mahasi Sayadaw type of path, the less interesting music would become to me. It would just become a series of disconnected notes that go nowhere. And that was, I think, a turning point for me in letting go of, I was pursuing, Vipassana practice pretty intently at that point, and I realized I wanted something that didn't need to negate aspects of reality or to undermine them into meaninglessness, while still being able to maybe cultivate freedom within the experience, but not to render them useless or meaningless or non-feeling. And I had been put off by Tibetan extravagance of imagery and ritual, but
Yeah.
after that, I really began to look to Tibetan tradition and actually found, to me, a fuller and more, from my Western point of view, relatable approach to emotion and the self and all of those things. Yeah.
Well, insight meditation, and it's often referred to as Buddhist Protestantism. And Tibetan Buddhism is more like Catholicism,
Yeah.
So,
Some years back, there was a study that was done. I read about it in one of the TSK books of collected essays, but there was a study that was done on the impact of TSK practice on practitioners. What kind of effects that practice had, over time. And the results of the study were inconclusive. They weren't able to really clearly demonstrate definite, trackable shifts across the whole population of TSK practitioners. And I don't think that necessarily in any way invalidates the TSK vision as an effective path. I think it just means maybe the right questions weren't asked or something. I know in my own life, I felt an impact and shift from working with these fundamental facets of reality and inquiring into them. I did a study at university when I was a university student. I talked to Tom Morse and Ken
Oh, yeah.
McKeon and multiple people about how their experience of time has shifted as they've gone deeper into TSK inquiry. So for yourself, what do you feel? Has there been an impact to your experience of time, space, and knowledge, or just an impact to yourself and to your way of being through these years of TSK inquiry?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I like the word appreciation.
Hmm.
It was kind of an ongoing sense of harmony or appreciation. Certainly, like, if I wanted to characterize it in terms of like meditative practice, I would say that the whole sense of having to do something and having to get somewhere is completely, I would say, undermined, or that doesn't really inform me. And I also I have a much more relaxed view of what it means to engage in meditation. So many people, I think, now have come to this view that it's formal sitting. And I get the question, what's your practice? I'm like, well, do I have to have one single practice? Do I have to tell you, what it is? That it's I don't know. I have to write something about this soon, because I get that question a lot. Some people. I guess that certainly I don't have any fear of death. I think that's important. That I just don't see any real passing of anything happening when it comes to that. Now, I'm healthy now. Maybe my view would change if I just got a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. But at least, right now, I don't feel any fear of death. I feel like if I need to and when I want to, I could focus extremely well and concentrate and use my energy in a very focused way for periods of time. At the same time, I don't feel driven I don't feel compulsive to do anything in particular. So, in a way, I feel it's a choice, the ability to choose. And I don't take the bait from people who are trying to provoke me, or even in ordinary personal relationships. I can pause very well and see what's going on more clearly in those interactions. And I have a sense of purpose. And that has fluctuated, and it is always changing what it means, and how that translates into activity. But life has a lot of meaning in a way which I think is very nice. I don't feel like I need a lot of things to. I could function with, maybe because I'm a 5 in the Enneagram. But yeah, maybe that's just an identity thing. But and I love knowledge. I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to seek more of what I'm interested in. That's really been amplified. If there's one thing I could say, is I don't take things at face value. And I'm a bit of a contrarian, challenging the conventional view of what's most, not just for the sake of challenging, but if I see something that doesn't quite make sense to me, I don't have any fear of speaking up or speaking out against something. If I've done my homework. And I became a musician late in my life. Yeah, I started playing electric guitar about 15 years ago, so when I was about 50 years old. And I have my own band now, and I think I've gotten better as a musician, a lead guitarist. So that's been a tremendous part of my life now. And I think it's really quite a nice counterpart to the academic side, because it's much more expressive and energetic. And I remember when I first started learning guitar, first 5, 6, 7 years or so, I noticed that there was a transfer effect that started happening when I was teaching classes, face-to-face classes. I felt that I was much more expressive, much more, I don't know, contacting students better in a way, energetically, and less of a kind of nerd in terms of, being detached as an academic. So I had fun, more fun.
I was thinking about your musical side as we were approaching, this interview, and I realized it wouldn't make sense to me at all to ask somebody really, how has being a Buddhist influenced your music, or how has being a Christian influenced your music? But for some
Yeah.
reason, it still makes sense to say, how has TSK influenced your music? Because it seems like it's a different thing. Um, there's a, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it does and it doesn't, because it could be influencing me without me knowing how, too.
Right.
But I take a lot of risk when it comes to music. I'm not afraid at all to really go crazy and improvise on solos, for example. And so I kind of try to allow that allowing quality to not get too tight when I'm playing. Because I notice when I do, it really does screw things up. And so there is this performance relaxation aspect. And then perhaps the time aspect is just kind of trying to conduct like a wire, like electric wires, that conducting metaphor, and just kind of just see what comes through. And yeah, so I think that's a key thing for me musically, and not to get too serious in terms of mistakes or what other people are doing in the band, not to get too overreactive about it. Like a lot of bands just completely blow up because of personal reactions and overreactions, and these bands always have a lot of drama. So try to have no drama.
Right. In your recent book on McMindfulness, which, by the way, I just want to congratulate you on the success of that McMindfulness. It was wonderful to see you suddenly popping up everywhere on RT and in so many places talking about this book. I was like, oh, I know him. But yeah, in your book, McMindfulness, you discuss, the problem of mindfulness having been co-opted by capitalism, turning it into a tool to keep people working on themselves and adjusting to their conditions rather than looking to the capitalist or corporatist systems in which they're embedded as possibly the real sources of their dis-ease, right? And that's also, I think you related it to maybe, the problem of parts of Buddhism having been extracted from their traditional contexts where there are other kinds of supports, a fuller vehicle for engaging with those practices, sort of watering them down and neutering them ethically. So in that light, thinking about TSK, which is a path of inquiry and a set of exercises, but it doesn't have some of those other supports that Buddhism has in terms of, ethical precepts or a sangha or anything like that. So do you see any danger in a McTSK if it or yeah, how do you relate to TSK in the context of your analysis of the mindfulness movement?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I've never thought of that question, but I know what you're saying. Well, if you had to classify TSK, it would probably fall under this idea of the innatist view. And then what I mean by that is that as you're working with these dimensions, and as the sense of ego-driven or ego-centric, acquisitive drives are opened up and challenged. So the sense of desire or greed, for example, will also dissolve or lessen. Since if you're really working with time, space, and knowledge, this sort of way of knowing is not driven by egocentric purposes. And that's what I mean by innatist, is that the practices and teachings and visions themselves are designed to evoke this kind of intimacy with all phenomena, and that means other people. It means the natural environment. So the sense of separation between self and other is completely, not completely, but eventually, gradually, ultimately becomes permeable. So the sense of compassion and caring is more spontaneous. It's not driven necessarily by rules or moral imperatives that are part of a catechism. It's more of a innate feature of the practice. So yes, but it can be instrumentalized. I would imagine people could take bits and pieces of it, and I've seen that done occasionally, to extract like a particular part of TSK, let's say on time, and then turn it into like a supercharged way of managing time to get things done, but not really. And that could be applied as, on Wall Street. You could become a better hedge fund manager by learning how to deal with time in a different way. So I would imagine that could be done. Then it would be McTSK. So there's nothing preventing anyone from instrumentalizing anything.
Right.
Especially when you embed it within a capitalist enterprise. I don't see how it could not be instrumentalized, and it would never get any traction if it wasn't. So it's just the nature of the game, the accommodationist game. Accommodate to the host institution, the host system. And that's kind of what happened with mindfulness. It became a privatized spirituality, which could easily be accommodated into existing systems that are driven by different motives than the Buddhist motive for awakening and compassion. And, when it's turned into an individualistic approach to improving self-improvement, then it'll thrive. It'll just thrive in a culture of narcissism. It becomes part of, the therapeutic culture, and coupled with, the neoliberal sort of imperative to fend for yourself, take care of yourself, you're on your own. You have to kind of brand yourself and update your mental capital, your mental capital, hack your brain, self-optimization, go a little deeper, find the authentic self within. All that sort of rhetoric is, very compatible with a privatized spirituality. Mm-hmm. And that's why, the mindfulness is a $2 billion industry now. And very market-friendly, very successful, marketing itself to the mainstream, to the masses, part of the happiness industry, the wellness industry. And yeah, so it's, same thing happened with mindfulness in a way.
Right. Yep. I've always felt that Zizek doesn't seem to fully understand Buddhism and what the project
No.
is, but I think he is right about that point about Buddhism being instrumentalized for capitalist gains. I think
Yeah.
you gave really beautiful and full
And,
damning
and,
expression to that insight with your
and
work.
mindfulness is also psychologized. It was
Right.
psychologized, and it was medicalized. It was scientized.
Mm.
And when you recontextualize it in that way, you have a different animal.
Right.
It becomes a biomedical technique,
Mm.
a useful one. Nobody's denying the fact that it has therapeutic benefits, and that's where it started, more in a medical setting. But once the genie got out of the bottle of the hospital clinics and became mainstreamed into corporations and the military and schools, and then we're talking about something quite different than just the therapeutic technique then.
There's a movement that is only in a few, I think, corners of kind of the humanizing, psychologizing of spiritual traditions, where they're looking at something like a sacred secularity, if you can do that in maybe a non-theistic sense. But I'm thinking of Raimon Panikar, where he's just looking at secular as actually a concern with time and with the dynamism of time, and a valuation of the dynamism of time, where it's not the spiritual, flight into a timelessness that is disengaged with the world and its expression and becoming, but there's a valuation of the whole, blossoming of being,
Immanence.
immanence, right, so that there could be a secularity, a secular spiritual path that is not plugged into traditional religious sources, or is not a traditional religion, and could be conversant with both science and religion, and doesn't fall into these, other traps that we were just talking about, kind of the narrow humanist and psychologizing approaches that kind of miss that depth, or that sacred potential, the mystery there. So I think TSK could be an answer to that kind of thing. What I wanted to say here is,
that's it.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's exactly what I think Tarthang Tulku's hope was for this teaching. It's exactly what you're describing. In order to avoid the dogmatism and reductionism and all the conflicts that would occur with splintering into sectarian views. So that's exactly what I think he had hoped that this new vision of reality would inspire. And I think that's important because we look at the axial age with Buddhism. The cosmological dualism of Buddhism was otherworldly, transcendent, nirvana. Well, at least in early Buddhism, the idea of, in Hinduism for that matter, of, negating this world, and this world is suffering. Of course, the Mahayana and Vajrayana kind of modulated that a bit. Then you still have the problem of it being a religion or a particular sect. So, yeah, how can we have sort of a cultural renaissance in a way that appreciates our absolute subjectivity in a way, without it becoming a fundamentalist position? And so I think it really does come down to questioning what is the human mind, what is consciousness in its ultimate context as well. Homo sapien. The homo part is our biology, and this is why we evolutionary our evolutionary inheritance is that we do have a mind which is protecting us from ensuring our survival, right? If we come across a snake in the grass, we will automatically react very quickly to it. The problem is that particular mechanism of mind seems to operate on seeing everything in the world as a snake in some degree. And so it's not serving us. It served us well as a species, but this sapient part of ourselves has always been there, and it's manifested historically in these religious traditions, a way of trying to come to terms with what is that aspect of ourselves. But like you said, it hasn't really fully flowered into a cultural worldview, right? That can get beyond the disciplinary boundaries, get beyond the institutional, religious, sectarianism, all that.
You're almost approaching an answer to the next thing I wanted to ask you. So we'll see if there's anything more to add after
Okay.
I ask you that. But, a lot of people consider us now to be, in the midst of what you might call a meta crisis, kind of multiple concurrent crises,
Yeah.
failures in the areas of meaning making,
Yeah.
of sense making, of legitimating knowledge, of having the capacity to take right action in the tangle of wicked messes that we find ourselves in. And there's a real wrestling with, what are the deep ontological and epistemological suppositions that are driving our current worldview and our way of approaching the world that may be compounding these crises. And is there a way, forward? How do we address the meta crisis? And so, do you feel that TSK in itself has something unique that it could contribute to this constellation of issues, to these perfect storm of crises right now?
Yeah. I see it as a profound alienation of our own way of knowing and all the repercussions of that coming back to bite us. With scientism and scientific materialism, you see the return of the repressed in terms of these alt-right movements and so forth, cults, and kind of this profound alienation of our own sense of knowing, which is, like you said, created this. So yeah, I mean, I think so. But the problem with these sorts of things is diffusion and accessibility and how you make these sorts of ideas, accessible to the masses, to the mainstream. That's sort of something I think that needs to be worked out. But I think there is something very, very unique, as I said in the beginning of the interview, that it's not something that could be pigeonholed or forced into our traditional categories. And I think that's what makes it valuable for what we need now. Because we're really talking about a different way of knowing, which, the reason why we're up against all these problems is because we have a way of knowing which has created alienation, and it's created a sense of sort of hubris over that we can control everything through technology, and everything else is like destroying the environment. And how do we go about it? How do we what do we do? Is an ongoing question that I think we're all trying to do our piece, and it's encouraging that these ideas are starting to percolate.
Right.
But I think that the question is, how do we convey these approaches using an idiom that's suitable to our time and our culture in which we live right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need something that's resonant with the needs of our current, as you say, the meta crisis that we're in. Science and reason have been our zeitgeist, and we can still appeal to that. We can still use critical intelligence, still use, hardcore philosophical investigation if we want to go in that direction. We can do that. We don't need to negate those qualities or capacities and just become, I just want to have direct experience and be experiential and reason has gotten us into this mess, so now let's just reject reason. That's sort of the other extreme. So we're really talking about balance and integration. Life is out of balance. Koyaanisqatsi, remember that movie?
Yes. Yeah.
Life out of balance. And talk about a great cinematic, artistic way of depicting this crisis. That movie came out quite early. And I thought it was one of the most intense movies to show the friction of our temporality in terms of how it operated on the surface of the earth and how it generated that kind of friction and heat. You think about heat, it's what's causing global warming. It's this kind of egoistic pursuit of needs which are driving the momentum of these activities on the surface of the earth. So I think we need to find ways, and this is where I think we may be missing the boat. Because I think art is maybe the way of reaching the masses more than writing articles. If you think about, what a movie can do, a really good movie that becomes popular all over the world can have a profound effect on people. Just look at the Italian Renaissance, what it did. I think we need visionary art, all kinds of different sorts of artistic exhibitions of this new vision, and in a way that taps into the masses. That's something I'm starting to think about a little bit. Can we take these ideas and turn them into like animations or something, or a museum of, Dharma College, which is in Berkeley, which I'm associated with now. I'm teaching there now. They're going to open what's called the Museum of the Mind, where they're going to have curated exhibits to try to evoke people's interest. But I'd like to see that be done like on Netflix, documentaries or dramas or music. Look at the 60s, what music did to the culture. So I think we need something like this to really have an impact. I think art's always been ahead, right? In terms of, if you look at Gebser's work, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And there's such resonance between, I think, Gebser's insights and some of the key TSK insights into time and perspective.
There's ways that we could work with virtual reality.
I was just going to mention that I recalled an article of yours some years ago where you looked at the potential of VR for tapping into some of this kind of exploration.
Yeah, I was really interested in virtual reality at that time, and evidently there's some resurgence of interest in that idea among some people in the Bay Area. That we may see something evolve from that.
That'd be fantastic. I agree. We really need, I think articles and books are still important, but
yeah, sure.
I agree that it seems our time now, maybe it's always been the case, as you're saying, that really the cultural mood and perspective shifts through a deeper aesthetic kind of immersion and engagement than just, orations. right?
Yeah,
Texts.
yeah. I mean, because we're academics, we're only like, talking to other academics, and unless you have a popular book, you might get, more traction. But yeah, to really get the culture moving, we definitely need to get into the artistic realm.
I think we're probably reaching the end of a time where people will be willing to keep watching a video. I could keep talking to you all day. Actually, I'm loving it. But last thing I wanted to ask you really is, when I first approached you about, having this conversation, you mentioned, oh, this was timely. There was kind of a renewed interest or investigation into TSK that you were getting into. What I just wanted to ask, kind of like, what's currently up for you right now in terms of your own interests or inquiries or practice?
Yeah, well, right now I've been assisting Richard Dixie, who is one of the senior teachers at Dharma College, who's teaching a course online on Zoom now on the book Revelations of Mind, also by Tarthang Tulku, quite recent. I think it came out in 2013 or 14. And he just recently wrote a very well-written commentary on the Revelations of Mind. The first volume is called Searcher Reaches Land's Limits, and he just finished volume 2. I helped him edit that last volume. So I've been involved with that course, and I'll be teaching that course in the fall at Dharma College. But I'm contemplating writing a formal commentary on time, space, and knowledge. Because I really enjoyed helping Richard with his commentary on Revelations of Mind. And I've had this in the back of my mind for a few years now. And so I feel the time's ready now. I've had a nice little break from the last book. I was quite busy with the media. I wasn't used to that. So I needed a break, and it's been a great break to kind of get back to studying time, space, and knowledge from the beginning. I just recently made a commitment to start fresh right from the beginning. I've probably read this book, I don't know, I've never counted how many times I read it, but it's always new, starting from the beginning, and kind of doing personal retreat over the summer on this. I think I cannot write a commentary without going back into it in a deep way, from an engaged way.
Right.
So that's what I'm hoping to do. And from that, I also have ideas about more original books that will be directly inspired by this vision, and I'm not so sure what those look like yet, but I do want to write stuff that addresses contemporary issues. And I have a bunch of notes, ideas that are cooking, kind of half-baked ideas here and there. But first, I think I need to write this commentary, and then from there, I'll see what unfolds.
Wonderful. I look forward to that, because I really appreciate the clarity of your writing. I think you really have a great style, and it helps, I think, open up complex ideas in a very accessible way.
It's probably my blue-collar Chicago upbringing.
Well, it's paying off. It's paying off for sure. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bruce. It was great. Like you said, we could keep talking. That would be good. Yeah. But my dog has to go for a walk. So.
Okay. Great.